The late afternoon sun baked the dust of Redemption Gulch into a hard, cracked shell. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with the scent of dried beans, cured leather, and the cloying sweetness of horehound candy. It was here, in this cramped bastion of commerce and gossip, that Eleanor Vance sought refuge in the crisp, logical world of legal precedent. Her belly, round and prominent beneath her worn calico dress, rested atop a heavy, leather-bound volume of Blackstone's commentaries. She was an island of silent concentration in a sea of murmuring disapproval. Still playing at being a man, Eleanor? The voice, sharp and coated in condescending sympathy, belonged to Mrs. Gable, the mercantile owner's wife. She was a woman whose influence was measured in the speed at which her whispers traveled. A few other women, sorting through bolts of fabric nearby, paused, their eyes flicking toward Eleanor with a mixture of pity and scorn. Eleanor didn't look up. She traced a line of text with her finger, her mind clinging to the precise language of torts and negligence. "I'm not playing, Mrs. Gable. I am studying." "Studying?" A brittle laugh escaped Mrs. Gable's lips. "Child, you're weeks from your confinement. You should be knitting boots, not filling your head with things that don't concern you. Law is for men with loud voices and deep pockets. Not, well," her gaze dropped meaningfully to Eleanor's swollen abdomen, and the unspoken words hung in the air. "Not for a pregnant, penniless widow." A low snicker rippled through the other customers. Eleanor's knuckles whitened where she gripped the book. Every day was a version of this. The sideways glances, the hushed conversations that ceased the moment she drew near, the open mockery. They saw a woman unmoored, broken by grief and addled by foolish notions. They saw a charity case in the making. They did not see the cold, burning fire of purpose that kept her upright. They did not see the meticulous case she was building in her mind, brick by painful brick. Her husband, Thomas, was dead, and she was certain his death was no accident. It was a debt of justice, and this book was her only currency. Just then, the door swung open, and a man strode in, bringing with him the scent of horse and open country. It was Mr. Sterling, the lawyer who represented Silas Croft, the wealthiest and most feared man in the territory. Sterling, a man whose smile never reaches cold eyes, tipped his hat to the ladies. His gaze fell upon Eleanor, and a look of amused contempt settled on his features. Well, if it isn't Portia herself," he drawled, his voice carrying through the suddenly silent store. "Found a loophole that'll make a woman the head of a household yet, Mrs. Vance." Humiliation, hot and sharp, pricked at Eleanor's eyes. She closed the heavy book with a soft thud. "I'm simply educating myself, Mr. Sterling." "An admirable, if fruitless, endeavor," he said smoothly, turning to collect a tin of tobacco. "Some things are best left to the professionals. You wouldn't try to shoe your own horse, would you?" Same principle applies. Before Eleanor could form a retort, the freight master, Hank, pushed his way inside, his face flushed with news. "He's here." Just saw his buckboard coming over the rise. "Judge Blackwood's in town." A different kind of murmur filled the store. The circuit judge. His arrival meant court would be in session, grievances aired, and disputes settled. For most, it was a diversion. For Mr. Sterling, it was business. For Eleanor, it was the precipice of a cliff she had no choice but to leap from. They called him the Judge Cowboy, a man said to value hard truths over polished rhetoric. He was her last, most improbable hope. They faced harsh judgment, but someone saw their true value. Before the story unfolds, tell us, have you ever stood up for someone unfairly judged? If you believe in looking beyond the surface, hit like and subscribe. As Sterling smirked, confident in the unassailable fortress of the established order, Eleanor clutched her book to her chest, the weight of it both a burden and an anchor. The judge was coming, and with his arrival, her quiet, desperate study was about to be dragged into the harsh, unforgiving light of day. Her world, and the smug certainty of men like Sterling, was about to be put on trial. The small room Eleanor rented at the back of the baker's shop was perpetually scented with yeast and cooling bread. It was a smell of life and sustenance that stood in stark contrast to the scent of decay that clung to her memories. The room contained little: a narrow bed, a washstand, a single rickety chair, and a small table piled high with books. These were her true possessions, the only part of her husband's legacy that mattered. Thomas had not been a man of means, but he had been a man of vision. A schoolteacher from back east, he had seen in Eleanor a mind as keen and fertile as the untouched prairie soil. He'd brought the books with him, a crate of legal texts that others might have deemed useless baggage. The law, Ellie, he'd told her, his hands gently framing her face, is the only thing that stands between civilization and the will of the strongest man. It's the great equalizer, if you know how to wield it. He had encouraged her reading, delighting in her sharp questions and intuitive grasp of complex ideas. They had dreamed of a future built not on land or cattle, but on principle and intellect. That dream had shattered 6 months ago on Silas Croft's North Pasture. Thomas, ever practical, had taken a job helping Croft's crew with the autumn roundup to save a little extra money before the baby came. The official story, delivered by a grim-faced foreman, was that a cattle chute gate had failed. A tragic accident. Croft had offered his condolences in a curt, dismissive letter, along with $2, what Thomas was owed for his final day's work. There was no mention of compensation, no acceptance of responsibility. Eleanor knew Thomas. He was meticulous, careful. He would never have been careless around machinery. In the weeks that followed, wrestling with a grief so profound it felt like a physical amputation, she began to ask quiet questions. She learned from a livery boy that the latch on that gate had been broken for months. She overheard a drunken ranch hand in the saloon muttering about how Croft had been warned about it, but refused to spend the money for a new hinge, claiming it was good enough. Her grief had slowly, painfully, transmuted into a cold, hard resolve. She had no money for a lawyer, and no lawyer in Redemption Gulch would dare cross Silas Croft anyway. So she turned to the only arsenal she possessed. Day after day, she sat with Thomas's books, the weight of their child growing within her a constant, living reminder of what she had lost and what she was fighting for. She read about duty of care, about negligence, about liability. The archaic language became a catechism, the dense paragraphs a roadmap. She was not just a grieving widow. She was counsel for the plaintiff, Thomas Vance. Judge Alastair Blackwood's arrival was less an entrance than a simple materialization. He did not roll into town in a polished carriage, but on the dusty seat of a plain buckboard pulled by a single, sturdy mule. He wore no black robes, only dusty denim trousers, a faded flannel shirt, and a battered hat that looked as if it had seen more thunderstorms than he had court cases. His face was leathered by the sun, and his eyes, a pale, startling blue, seemed to miss nothing. He was a man of the land first and a man of the law second, which made him an unpredictable and often formidable force. He tied his mule outside the saloon, ignoring the obsequious greetings of the town's mayor. His first stop was always the same, a quiet walk through the town to take its measure. It was during this constitutional that he first saw her. Eleanor was walking from the mercantile, her steps measured and deliberate, one hand protectively cradling her belly, the other clutching a heavy book to her chest as if it were a shield. He saw the way Mrs. Gable and her friends watched her from the storefront, their faces a mask of righteous pity. He saw the way 2 cow hands tipped their hats with exaggerated, mocking courtesy. He saw her chin lift a fraction of an inch higher in response. Blackwood was a man who understood the nuances of a landscape, be it rock and soil or gossip and scorn. He saw an outlier, a person who did not fit the established topography of the town. He was intrigued. Later that evening, from his corner table in the saloon, he saw the town's power structure in its natural habitat. Silas Croft held court, a thick cigar clamped in his teeth, his laughter booming over the tinny piano. Beside him, Mr. Sterling sipped his whiskey, sleek and self-assured. "Heard the little widow Vance is still at her books," Croft said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Thinks she's going to sue me." Sterling chuckled. "Let her play. It keeps her occupied. Besides, What judge in his right mind would even entertain such a farce? He caught sight of Blackwood in the corner and raised his glass in a mock toast. Present company accepted, of course, Your Honor. We all know you uphold the sanctity of the law. Judge Blackwood simply nodded, his expression unreadable. He took a slow sip of his beer, the pale blue eyes missing nothing. The awkward silence of Eleanor's boarding house room, the scorn in the mercantile, the arrogant laughter in the saloon, they were all pieces of a puzzle. He didn't know the full picture yet, but he recognized the familiar shapes of injustice and arrogance. He watched Eleanor in his mind's eye, a lone woman walking against the wind, clutching a book of laws that were supposed to protect the weak, and felt a stir of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a case that might actually matter. The first step was the hardest. It required walking across the dusty main street, up the 3 wooden steps of the town hall, which doubled as a courthouse, and into the office of Mr. Abernathy, the town clerk. He was a small, perpetually nervous man who owed his position, and thus his loyalty, to the town's established hierarchy. Eleanor had her petition written out in neat, precise script on 2 pages of precious paper. It detailed the timeline of events, the known fault in the equipment, and a legal basis for her claim of wrongful death due to negligence. She had checked and rechecked her wording against the examples in her books. It was concise, factual, and she believed legally sound. Mr. Abernathy read it, his spectacles slipping down his nose. He began to sweat. Mrs. Vance. Eleanor, he stammered, avoiding her eyes. I don't know if I can accept this. It is a formal petition, Mr. Abernathy, Eleanor said, her voice quiet but firm. It is your duty to file it and add it to the docket for the circuit judge. But it's against Mr. Croft, and it's written by you. He said the last part as if it were the most insurmountable obstacle of all. As if on cue, the door opened and Mr. Sterling entered. He took in the scene with a theatrical sigh. Abernathy, what is the meaning of this? Is Mrs. Vance bothering you? She has a petition, Mr. Sterling, the clerk squeaked, holding the papers out like a shield. Sterling plucked them from his hand and scanned them, a bemused smile playing on his lips. He let out a soft, cruel chuckle. My dear Mrs. Vance, this is quite the piece of fiction. A valiant effort, I'll grant you, but it has no more legal standing than a child's drawing. You're not a member of the bar. You cannot file a suit. This is improper, it is irregular, and frankly, it is embarrassing. He tore the petition neatly in half, then in half again, and let the pieces flutter into the wastebasket. This is nothing more than a desperate, hysterical plea for money, he continued, his voice hardening. Mr. Croft was generous enough to overlook your husband's carelessness, and this is how you repay his kindness? By attempting to slander his good name with this nonsense. The public nature of the humiliation was a physical blow. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. The clerk stared at his desk, a monument to spinelessness. For a moment, she could say nothing. The injustice of it was so vast, so complete, it stole the air from her lungs. She finally found her voice, a strained whisper. You have no right. I have every right, Sterling countered smoothly. I am an officer of the court, protecting it from frivolous and vexatious litigation. I suggest you go home, Mrs. Vance, and focus on your maternal duties. She turned and walked out, her back ramrod straight, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her tears. She did not know that Judge Blackwood, on his way to the clerk's office to review the docket himself, had been standing in the shadows of the hallway, a silent witness to the entire exchange. He watched her retreat, a solitary, defiant figure, and then looked at the smug lawyer and the trembling clerk. He said nothing, but his jaw was set like granite. That evening, a soft knock fell on her door. Eleanor opened it to find Judge Blackwood standing there, his battered hat in his hands. He was even taller up close, and his presence seemed to fill the small hallway. Mrs. Vance, he said, his voice a low rumble. May I have a word? Stunned, she could only nod and step aside, gesturing toward the single chair in her room. He ignored it, his gaze sweeping over the stacks of books. Sterling tells me you've been bothering his clerk. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement, a prompt. Eleanor's initial fear gave way to the familiar burn of indignation. Mr. Sterling tore up my petition. "I'm aware," the judge said, his eyes finally settling on her. He called it frivolous. Was it? This was the test. He was not offering sympathy. He was assessing her. She met his gaze directly, her own eyes clear and steady. It was a suit for wrongful death due to gross negligence on the part of Silas Croft, whose failure to maintain his equipment directly resulted in the death of my husband, Thomas Vance. I cited 3 precedents regarding employer liability and duty of care. I had a witness statement, albeit an unsigned one. You can tell me if that sounds frivolous, Your Honor. A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his pale eyes. He was used to bluster, to emotion, to please. He was not used to such calm, factual recitation from a layperson, let alone a woman in her position. "Show me," he said. It was not a request, but a command. Her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. She took a deep breath, retrieved her draft copy from beneath a loose floorboard, a precaution she'd had the foresight to take, and handed it to him. He took the pages and began to read, his face impassive. The only sound in the room was the gentle hiss of the lamp and the distant, comforting rumble of the baker's ovens. He read every word, his brow furrowed in concentration. When he finished, he folded the papers carefully and looked at her again. The room was charged with a heavy silence. He didn't say if it was good or bad, brilliant or foolish. He simply said, "Court will be in session Thursday morning. Mr. Abernathy will have a new petition to file, one that won't be so easy to tear." He handed the papers back to her, gave a short, sharp nod, and left as quietly as he had arrived. Eleanor stood frozen in the middle of her small room, the pages trembling in her hand. He hadn't promised her victory. He hadn't promised her success. He had promised her a door. And for the first time in 6 months, she felt the faintest glimmer of light shining through its cracks. The news that Judge Blackwood had ordered Eleanor's petition to be officially filed landed in Redemption Gulch with the force of a thunderclap on a clear day. Mr. Abernathy, his face pale with terror, had no choice but to transcribe her claim into the official ledger, his hand shaking so badly the script was nearly illegible. The docket was posted outside the town hall, and her name, Eleanor Vance, stood against that of Silas Croft. It was an impossible David against a Goliath who owned the whole valley. The town buzzed with speculation. Sterling, furious at being so publicly overruled, strode into the saloon where Judge Blackwood was taking his evening meal. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is an outrage," he declared, his voice tight with anger. "You're making a mockery of established procedure. The woman is not a lawyer. She is an unstable, grieving widow looking for a handout." Blackwood finished chewing a piece of steak before looking up. "Are you suggesting, Mr. Sterling, that justice is only available to those who can afford your fees? Or that a valid claim becomes invalid simply because of the identity of the person making it?" "I am suggesting," Sterling retorted, "that rules exist for a reason. Allowing this to proceed sets a dangerous precedent. Every disgruntled farmhand, every clumsy stable boy will think they can clog the court with baseless claims. Then it will be my job to determine which claims are baseless," the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And I will do so in my courtroom, not in this saloon. My decision is made. A preliminary hearing will be held to determine if this case has merit to proceed to trial. You and your client will be there." He picked up his fork, a clear dismissal. Sterling stood fuming for a moment before turning on his heel and storming out, his humiliation now a public spectacle. In the days that followed, Eleanor felt the atmosphere of the town shift from one of mocking pity to one of open hostility. Silas Croft, unused to being challenged, began to exert his pressure. The baker, a decent man but fearful of losing Croft's business, informed Eleanor apologetically that he needed her room back at the end of the week. Mrs. Gable at the mercantile suddenly found she was just out of the lamp oil and coffee Eleanor tried to buy. Whispers followed her everywhere, no longer about her foolishness, but about her audacity, her ingratitude. She was a troublemaker, an agitator. The isolation was a heavy cloak. Doubt, a cold and insidious serpent, began to coil in her stomach. What was she doing? She was one woman against an entire system. She was risking what little stability she had. For what? A principle? Her meager savings were dwindling. Soon she would have nowhere to live. The baby kicked, a sharp, insistent reminder of a life that depended entirely on her. One evening, sitting in her darkening room, the unlit lamp on the table, she buried her face in her hands and wept. The weight of it all, the grief, the fear, the relentless pressure, was crushing her. A knock on the door startled her. She hastily wiped her eyes and opened it to find Judge Blackwood. He held a small burlap sack in one hand. He didn't ask to come in, just stood on the threshold, his expression grim. "Heard the baker's turning you out," he said. Eleanor just nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "And that the mercantile is short on supplies for you." He held out the sack. Some coffee, a tin of kerosene, and a ham. The hotel kitchen had extra. He wasn't looking at her, but at some point over her shoulder, as if the transaction embarrassed him. "I can't," she started, her voice thick. "I can't pay you. It's not a loan," he grunted. "Consider it an advance on court resources. Can't have a litigant starving before she's had her day in court." Bad for appearances, the gruff explanation was a thin veil for the raw kindness of the act. He still didn't leave. He seemed to be searching for words, a task that clearly came less easily to him than handing down judgments. "When I was a young man," he said finally, his gaze distant, "I had a small ranch over in the Blue Creek Basin. A big cattle baron decided he wanted my water rights. He had the money, the lawyers, the sheriff in his pocket. Everyone told me to sell out, to take what he offered and be grateful. I didn't." He paused. "I lost everything. Had to start over." He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw past the judge, past the gruff exterior to the man beneath. She saw the ghost of that defeat in his pale eyes. "But I was right," he said, his voice low and fierce, "and I never regretted fighting for it. Don't you regret it either, Mrs. Vance." He placed the sack on the floor just inside her door, tipped his hat, and was gone. Eleanor stared at the bag of groceries, at the tangible proof that she was not entirely alone. His story, his loss, was a greater gift than the food. He had not offered her pity. He had offered her kinship, the shared understanding of two people who knew what it was to stand against the tide. The serpent of doubt in her belly uncoiled. Her resolve hardened, no longer brittle, but forged in a new fire. The next day she sought him out, not at the hotel or the saloon, but at the livery, where she knew he tended to his own mule. She found him brushing the animal's coat, his movements economical and sure. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady. He grunted in acknowledgement without turning. "I've been reading about discovery, about the right to question witnesses before trial." He stopped brushing and turned to face her, intrigued. "Go on." "There was a man, an old ranch hand named Jebediah. He was there when the gate broke. He quit Croft's employ a week later. I believe he knows that Mr. Croft was aware of the faulty latch. But he's terrified. He won't speak to me." Blackwood considered this, stroking the mule's nose. "A subpoena can compel a man to appear in court, Mrs. Vance. It cannot compel him to find his courage." "I know," she said, "but to start, is it within my right to ask the court to issue one for the hearing?" "It is," he confirmed. "And my petition, you said it was for a preliminary hearing. What is the standard of proof required?" He leaned against the stall, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He was no longer talking to a victim. He was talking to a colleague. For the next hour, amidst the smell of hay and manure, they discussed legal strategy. He didn't give her answers, but he asked questions that forced her to sharpen her own arguments. He pointed her towards sections of the legal code she had overlooked, treating her not with condescension, but with the rough respect of a master craftsman guiding a promising apprentice. She saw the keen, analytical mind behind the weathered face. He saw the sharp, unyielding intellect behind the pregnant belly and the worn dress. A new kind of connection was being forged between them, a bond built on the shared language of justice. Emboldened, Eleanor redoubled her efforts. She used the last of her money not for food, but to pay a freight driver to deliver a letter to a cousin in a town 50 miles away, asking for a place to stay should the worst happen. She spent her days in the town hall's small, dusty records room, poring over land deeds and business filings, learning everything she could about Silas Croft's operations, looking for any other instance of negligence, any other corner cut that might establish a pattern. The town watched her with a new, grudging respect. The mockery had not ceased entirely, but it was quieter now, laced with a grudging curiosity. This woman was not collapsing. She was fighting, and the judge Cowboy himself seemed to be in her corner. The day of the preliminary hearing dawned clear and cold. The makeshift courthouse in the town hall was packed. It was the best show the town had seen in years. Silas Croft sat at the defendant's table with Sterling, looking utterly unconcerned, as if swatting away a fly. Eleanor walked in alone. She took her place at the plaintiff's table, a small island in a hostile sea. She placed a single, neatly stacked pile of notes in front of her. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. She could feel the rhythmic thump of her baby's movements, a steady, reassuring beat against her ribs. She was not one person at this table. She was two. Judge Blackwood entered, and the room fell silent. He sat, surveyed the room, and his gaze rested for a moment on Eleanor. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the encouragement she needed. She took a deep breath as he banged the gavel. The hearing and her fight for justice had begun. "The court is now in session," Judge Blackwood announced, his voice cutting through the expectant hush of the room. "We are here for a preliminary hearing in the matter of Vance versus Croft. The purpose of this hearing is to determine if the plaintiff's claim has sufficient merit to proceed to a full trial. Mr. Sterling, you may begin." Sterling rose, a portrait of polished confidence. He strolled before the judge's bench, his hands clasped behind his back. "Your Honor, this is, with all due respect, a tragic waste of the court's valuable time. We have here a claim with no legal foundation, brought by an individual with no legal standing. It is a textbook definition of a frivolous suit." His argument was a masterclass in condescension. He never looked at Eleanor, referring to her only as the woman or the grieving widow. He painted her as emotionally unstable, her judgment clouded by grief, lashing out at a benevolent benefactor. Mr. Croft, a pillar of this community, offered his sincere condolences for what was a deeply unfortunate accident, an accident for which my client bears no responsibility. In return for his charity, he is dragged into this spectacle, his name sullied by baseless accusations born of hysteria. He gestured toward Eleanor. She is not a member of the state bar. She is not an officer of the court. She is a layperson, and a distressed one at that. To allow her to bring this suit is to open the floodgates. By what right does she stand before this court and make these claims? By what right does she command our attention? He sat down, a smug, satisfied look on his face. The message was clear. She did not belong here. Judge Blackwood listened patiently, his face a stony mask. When Sterling had finished, he turned his gaze to Eleanor. "Mrs. Vance, you have heard Mr. Sterling's argument. The court now gives you the floor. You may respond." This was the moment. Every eye in the room was on her. A wave of dizziness washed over her as she slowly pushed her chair back and stood. The floorboards seemed to sway beneath her feet. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She rested one hand on the table to steady herself, the other on her belly. She looked at the faces in the crowd, the curious, the hostile, the indifferent. She saw Mrs. Gable, her lips pursed in disapproval. She saw the baker, wringing his hands. She saw Silas Croft, smirking. Then she looked at Judge Blackwood. He was not looking at her with pity, but with a level, expectant gaze. He was giving her this stage. He trusted her to use it. That silent vote of confidence was all she needed. The dizziness subsided, replaced by a cold, clear focus. She did not address Sterling's insults. She did not speak of her grief. She spoke to the law. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clearer and stronger than she had expected. Mr. Sterling raises the question of my standing. I am the widow of the deceased, Thomas Vance, and the executrix of his estate, such as it is. I am the sole party with an interest in seeking justice for his death. If I have no standing, then who does? She paused, letting the simple logic of her question settle in the room. He calls my claim baseless. My claim is based on the established principle of duty of care, which states an employer has a responsibility to provide a reasonably safe environment for his workers. My claim is based on evidence. Evidence I believe will show that Mr. Croft was informed on multiple occasions that the cattle chute latch was faulty and posed a danger, yet he willfully chose not to repair it to save the cost of a $2 hinge. A man's life, Your Honor, for the price of a hinge. The murmur in the room was different now. It was no longer mockery, but surprise. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't hysterical. She was laying out a case. Mr. Sterling is correct about one thing, she continued, turning her gaze toward the lawyer for the first time. I'm not a member of the bar. I do not have a fancy office or a long list of wealthy clients. All I have are the facts, the truth of what happened to my husband. And these books, she gestured to the worn copy of Blackstone she had brought with her. These books say the law is a shield for all, not a sword for the powerful. They say that justice should not depend on the station of the person seeking it. I am asking this court to affirm that principle. She looked back to the judge. I have a witness, Jebediah Kane, who I believe will testify to Mr. Croft's prior knowledge of the danger. I have the smith's own testimony that he offered to repair the latch weeks before the incident. This is not hysteria, Your Honor. This is a case, and it deserves to be heard. She sat down, her body trembling with adrenaline. The silence in the room was absolute. Sterling's face had lost its smirk, replaced by a look of disbelief. Silas Croft's confident posture had stiffened. They had expected tears and accusations. They had been met with Blackstone. Judge Blackwood surveyed the room, his gaze lingering on Croft and Sterling. He let the silence stretch, thick and heavy. Mr. Sterling, he said finally, your argument rests on the petitioner's status. Mrs. Vance's argument rests on the facts. It is the long-held tradition of our jurisprudence that facts, not status, are the substance of the law. He picked up his gavel. This court finds that the plaintiff's claim is neither frivolous nor without merit. There is sufficient cause to proceed. A collective gasp went through the room. Therefore, the judge continued, his voice ringing with authority, this matter will be set for a full trial to be held in this courtroom 1 week from today. He paused, looking directly at Eleanor. Furthermore, given that no member of the local bar has seen fit to offer this woman counsel, and given the clarity and competence of the argument she has just presented on her own behalf, this court, in the interest of seeing justice done, will make an exception to formal procedure. The air crackled with anticipation. Mrs. Vance will be permitted to argue her own case. The room erupted. Shouts of protest and disbelief mingled with astonished whispers. Sterling leaped to his feet, his face purple with rage. Your Honor, you cannot be serious. This is unprecedented. It is a circus. Blackwood brought the gavel down with a crack that silenced the room. It is my courtroom, Mr. Sterling, and in my courtroom, justice will not be denied on a technicality. The purpose of a trial is to find the truth. It seems to me that Mrs. Vance is more interested in finding it than you are. My decision is final. He banged the gavel again. This hearing is adjourned. As the judge swept from the room, all eyes remained on Eleanor. She sat still at her table, a lone woman who had just been granted the right to face down the most powerful man in the valley. The mockery was gone, replaced by a stunned, fearful respect. She had walked into the room a victim. She would walk out a warrior. The week leading up to the trial was a blur of frantic preparation and escalating tension. The town of Redemption Gulch held its breath. The lines were drawn. On one side stood Silas Croft, his wealth, and his slick lawyer. On the other, a pregnant widow with a stack of books and the surprising sanction of the circuit judge. Eleanor barely slept. She lived on bread and coffee, her small room lit by kerosene late into the night. Her table was a chaotic map of her strategy. Notes on witness questions, sketches of the faulty latch, and pages of legal arguments. Her greatest challenge remained Jebediah Kane. Armed with a court-issued subpoena delivered by the town's reluctant sheriff, she found the old ranch hand at his tiny homestead miles out of town. He was a stooped, frightened man, his hands trembling as he held the paper. "They'll ruin me, ma'am," he pleaded, his eyes darting nervously toward the road. "Mr. Croft, he's got a long reach. If I testify, I'll lose this little plot. It's all I got." Eleanor looked at the man's weathered face, at the genuine terror in his eyes. She could not bring herself to threaten him with the law. Instead, she spoke of Thomas. "Jebediah, my husband considered you a friend. He said you were a good man, a man who knew right from wrong. I'm not asking you to lie or to invent anything. I'm just asking you to tell the court what you told me that day behind the stables. Tell them the truth." "The truth don't pay the bills, Mrs. Vance," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the dirt floor. "No," she said softly, "but it lets you sleep at night. That's worth something, isn't it?" She left him with that, the subpoena lying on his rough-hewn table, a silent summons to his own conscience. She didn't know if he would appear. The night before the trial, Judge Blackwood found her walking by the creek at the edge of town, trying to calm the storm of nerves inside her. He didn't speak at first, just fell in a step beside her. The sky was a deep, star-dusted velvet. "Are you ready?" he finally asked. "I don't know," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "What if he doesn't come? What if my questions are wrong? What if I fail?" "You have not failed, Eleanor," he said, using her first name for the first time. It sounded strange and resonant in the quiet night. "You have already succeeded. You forced the truth into a room where it was not welcome. That is a victory in itself. The rest is just procedure." He stopped and turned to face her. "Sterling will try to bully your witness. He will try to make you emotional. He will twist your words. Don't fall into his traps. Stick to what you know. Stick to the facts. The truth has a weight of its own. You just have to clear the path for it." She looked up at his shadowed face, at the unexpected kindness in his eyes. "Why are you doing this? Helping me?" He looked away, toward the vast, dark prairie. "I told you I lost my ranch once. What I didn't tell you is why. The cattle baron who took my water, he did it by bribing the judge. I saw firsthand what happens when the law is for sale. I became a judge to make sure I never saw it again. You're not just fighting for your husband. You're fighting for the idea that the law is still worth something. And that's a fight I'm honored to witness." The day of the trial, the town hall was so crowded that people spilled out into the street, straining to hear through the open windows. The air was thick with anticipation. Silas Croft sat impassively, a block of granite confidence. Sterling arranged his papers, shooting Eleanor a look of pure venom. She ignored him. She set her notes on the table, took a deep breath, and waited. The trial began, and the first witness called was Jebediah Kane. To Eleanor's profound relief, he was there, sitting hunched on the witness stand, looking like a cornered animal. Sterling handled the direct examination, quickly establishing that Jebediah was a former employee and that Thomas Vance's death was a tragic accident. Then he turned the witness over to Eleanor. "Your witness," he said with a dismissive wave. Eleanor rose and approached the stand. She did not stand over him or try to intimidate him. She stood at a respectful distance, her expression one of quiet empathy. "Mr. Kane," she began, her voice calm and steady. "You worked for Mr. Croft for nearly 15 years, did you not?" "Yes, ma'am," he mumbled. "So you would be familiar with the equipment on the ranch. Specifically, the cattle chute on the north pasture?" "I would." "Could you describe the condition of the locking latch on that chute's main gate in the weeks leading up to my husband's death?" Sterling shot to his feet. "Objection. Relevance? The witness has already testified it was an accident." "Overruled," Judge Blackwood said instantly. "The condition of the equipment is entirely relevant. The witness will answer." Jebediah swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward Croft. It was worn," he stammered. "Sometimes it wouldn't catch right." "It wouldn't catch right," Eleanor repeated gently. "Did you ever bring this to anyone's attention?" Jebediah hesitated, his gaze fixed on his own gnarled hands. This was the moment. The fate of her entire case rested on his answer. "Mr. Kane?" Eleanor prompted softly. "The court is waiting." The old man took a shuddering breath. He seemed to shrink, but then he straightened his shoulders, a flicker of long-buried dignity in his eyes. He looked directly at Silas Croft. "I did," he said, his voice suddenly clear and strong. "I told the foreman, Mr. Harris, twice, and then I told Mr. Croft himself. Told him that latch was a death trap waiting to happen." A shocked silence fell over the room. Croft's face, for the first time, lost its composure. A muscle twitched in his jaw. "And what was Mr. Croft's response when you told him this?" Eleanor asked, pressing her advantage. "He told me we were wasting time," Jebediah said, the words tumbling out now that the dam had broken. "He said a new hinge cost $2, and he wasn't spending it until the old one fell off completely. He said we should just give a good kick to make sure it's set." The image was devastating. A man's life, weighed against the cost of a hinge and dismissed with a kick. Sterling, desperate to regain control, launched into a savage cross-examination. He badgered Jebediah, accused him of being a disgruntled employee, of inventing the story to get back at his former boss. But the old man, having found his courage, held firm. His story never wavered. He had told the truth, and it had set him free. When he was done, there was only one thing left: Eleanor's closing argument. She stood before the court, not just as a petitioner, but as the sole voice for a man who had been silenced. She looked at the faces of the townspeople, her neighbors. "For 6 months," she began, her voice ringing with quiet passion, "I have been known in this town as the grieving widow, the foolish woman with her books. But I am not here today asking for your pity. I am here asking for justice. Not just for me, but for my husband, Thomas. And not just for Thomas, but for the principles this community is supposed to be built on." She turned toward Croft. "This is a man who values $1 more than a human life, who saw a danger, was warned of it, and chose to do nothing. Is that the kind of leadership we accept? The kind of man we allow to stand as a pillar of our community?" Her hand went to her belly. "My husband will never meet his child. This child will never know its father's love, or his integrity, or his belief that doing the right thing matters. And why? Because of a broken latch. Because of a conscious, deliberate choice to place profit above safety." She faced the judge. "The law is more than words in a book, Your Honor. It is the conscience of a people. It is the measure of our civilization. I have put my faith in that law. I ask you now to show this town, to show Mr. Croft, that that faith was not misplaced. I ask you to find for the plaintiff." She sat down, her entire body trembling. She had nothing left. She had poured out every bit of her strength, her intellect, and her heart. Judge Blackwood sat in silence for a long moment, his gaze sweeping from the pale, shaken face of Jebediah Kane to the furious, impotent face of Mr. Sterling, to the stony, defeated face of Silas Croft. Finally, his eyes came to rest on Eleanor. "In a matter of Vance versus Croft," he said, his voice resonating with an iron authority, "this court has heard the testimony presented. It has heard of a repeated danger, a warning ignored, and a death that was not accidental, but inevitable." He looked directly at Silas Croft. "The greatness of a man is not measured by the size of his herd or the weight of his purse. It is measured by his character. By that measure, Mr. Croft, you are a very small man indeed." The word struck Croft like a physical blow. "This court finds for the plaintiff. I award Mrs. Vance the sum of $5,000 in damages for the wrongful death of her husband, a sum sufficient to ensure the security of her and her child." A gasp echoed through the room. It was a fortune. "Furthermore," the judge continued, his voice like ice, "this court finds Mr. Croft's willful negligence to be so profound as to constitute a public endangerment. A copy of this judgment will be sent to the Territorial Marshal's office with a recommendation for a full investigation into his business practices." He brought the gavel down with a final definitive crack. "This court is adjourned." It was over. Silas Croft's reign of impunity was shattered. Sterling stood speechless. The townspeople looked at Eleanor not with pity or scorn, but with a stunned, profound awe. She had done the impossible. She had wielded the law like a sword of righteousness, and she had won. In a quiet aftermath, the noise and excitement of the town hall faded into a distant buzz. Eleanor sat alone at the plaintiff's table, the adrenaline slowly seeping out of her, leaving a profound and bone-deep weariness in its place. It was a victor's exhaustion. She ran a hand over the worn cover of her Blackstones, a silent thank you to her husband. She had done it. She had secured their child's future, but more than that, she had reclaimed Thomas's dignity from the dismissive label of an accident. She had won him justice. Judge Blackwood approached the table. The hard lines of his judicial authority softened now. The crowd had parted for him, a new kind of respect in their eyes for the man who had facilitated this seismic shift in their town's power structure. He stopped before her table, holding his battered hat in his hands. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice gentle, "you are magnificent." She looked up, managing a small, tired smile. "I had a good teacher." "The law was your teacher," he corrected softly. "You just had the courage to listen." He paused, his gaze dropping to her hand, which still rested on the book. Thomas Vance would be very proud. At the mention of her husband's name, the emotion she had held at bay for so long finally threatened to overwhelm her. A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of catharsis, of a burden finally laid down. The judge simply stood there, a silent, grounding presence, allowing her the dignity of the moment. He didn't offer empty platitudes or awkward comforts. He offered her his quiet respect, which was worth more than any words. The space between them was no longer defined by a bench and a petitioner's table. It was now a space of shared victory and profound, unspoken understanding. He saw her not as a case, not as a widow, but as Eleanor, a woman of astonishing resilience and intellect. She saw him not as a judge, but as Alistair, the man whose belief in the law was matched only by his belief in her. A few townsfolk, led by the baker and even a shamefaced Mrs. Gable, approached hesitantly, offering congratulations and quiet apologies. Their scorn had been replaced by admiration. She was no longer an outcast. She had become a landmark in the moral landscape of their town. The next morning, Judge Blackwood was preparing to leave, his mule hitched to the buckboard. His circuit duties called him onward to the next town, the next set of disputes. But he made one last stop. He drew up before the baker's shop, where Eleanor was just emerging. She had been informed that her room was hers for as long as she needed it, rent-free. She came to the edge of the boardwalk, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "You're leaving," she stated. It wasn't a question. "The law doesn't sit still for long," he said with a wry smile. He looked at her, at the new confidence in her posture, the peace that had settled in her eyes. The haunted look was gone. "You'll be all right here now." "Yes," she said, her hand resting on her belly in a gesture that was now purely protective and hopeful. "I believe we will." He fiddled with the reins, a man more comfortable with legal statutes than with goodbyes. "I'll be back through this way in the spring," he said, to check on the docket. It was a simple statement, but it held the weight of a promise. It wasn't about romance, not yet. It was about continuity, about a connection forged in a crucible of injustice that would not be easily broken. It was a promise to return to the place where he had seen the law and a remarkable woman at their very best. "I'll look for you, Judge Blackwood," she said softly. "Alistair," he corrected. He tipped his hat, a gesture that was no longer a formality, but a sign of deep and abiding respect. With a final look, he clucked to his mule and rode out of town, his solitary figure shrinking against the vastness of the prairie. Eleanor watched him go, a quiet smile on her face. She stood there for a long time, the sun warming her face, a gentle breeze stirring the dust of the street. Redemption Gulch was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was the sound of a new beginning, earned by courage, anchored in justice, and filled with the promise of the future she held growing safely within her. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. Her true worth was finally seen. What does true value in a person mean to you? Tell us below.